Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you might happen to be watching this. We are thrilled that you have joined us together this week for Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church Sunday School. Today, we want to finish up the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible. I know that I said I finished it up last week, but I had forgotten a book, the book of Haggai. Forgive me for that. Somebody wrote to me and said, hey, what about Haggai? And I had to admit that I had forgotten it. And Haggai really only makes sense with the backstory in mind. So in 586, the people of Jerusalem had come back. The people of Israel had come back. And the temple of Jerusalem was the symbol of God's presence on earth. And it had been destroyed during the Babylonian siege. As a result of it being destroyed, the majority of people came back and they were told by God that they needed to rebuild the temple. And then after they had been there for a while, they started to build it. But then after they had been there for a while, they got kind of tired of it. And they weren't for 2 years on the temple, but their security was compromised, and they stopped their work in 536 BC. You can see that in Ezra. One of the things that you will notice is that Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, all these books about the building of the temple fit together. And no one worked on the temple for another 15 years. And that's what Haggai is about. That's the background that comes into this book of Haggai. It tells the story of these Jewish exiles and their security issues. But their security issues came about as a direct result of them losing sight of the work that Yahweh had given them. And as a result of the fact that they didn't focus on rebuilding the temple that God had told them to build, they had problems. When I was a child, for whatever reason, and I don't know what reason, we called this book Haggai. So if at some point I start calling the book Haggai, I'm reverting back to my childhood. But the correct pronunciation is Haggai, and I'll do my best to try to pronounce it correctly. This is a picture to remind you of the book of Haggai and the contents of Haggai. This fellow, you see this man, is hugging a big letter I. So it must be the prophet Haggai or Haggai. And he's on his way to the temple. And so the key word for Haggai is the temple. Having just returned from exile in Babylonia, the people are confronted by this heartbreaking sight of the temple being nothing. Nebuchadnezzar had left their temple in a shambles. And so what was once this beautiful, immaculate, incredible building of Solomon's temple now becomes this rubble. And as a result of that, Haggai tells them, you've got to stop your wasting time and rebuild the temple. And he calls upon the builders to have renewed courage in spite of the fact that they might feel in danger, and to rebuild the temple as it once was, and to trust in the God who controls the future. So the theme is that God encourages his people to be fully committed to him. And this involves rebuilding his temple. That's how they know that they are committed to God, that God has told them to rebuild the temple. Here are some events that will sort of help you. They return from exile and they start rebuilding the temple. And you can see this returned exile starting to rebuild the temple in Ezra 2, and in Haggai 1, and in Zechariah 1. In all those places, there are mentions of the temple being rebuilt. Then there are prophecies about the temple and the people that Ezra and Haggai tell them to rebuild, and even Zechariah. In chapter 1, Haggai delivers his first message about rebuilding the temple. And that's where we begin the book of Haggai. It was written by Haggai, who had prophesied in Judah probably around 520 BC. Again, all these dates they're around, they're not exact. But one of the things that we should remember is that in Haggai and in Ezra 5 and Ezra 6, these are the only real mentions of the man Haggai. And both narratives in Haggai and in Ezra 5, 1 and 2 and 6, 14, the narratives say that this prophet influenced the people to complete the temple, rebuilding the temple. But they tell us nothing about Haggai's family or about his birthplace or call to be a prophet. There's nothing like that in there. This is a statement by John Chrysostom. You might not be familiar with John Chrysostom. He was a very, very early church father, and he was called the golden-mouthed one because his sermons were so looked upon as such fine examples of the sermonic art that he was the man with the golden mouth, John Chrysostom. And John Chrysostom says, the rich man is not one who is in possession of much, but one who gives much. That ought to maybe make us pause and think about what we do with the assets that the Lord has given us, what we do with the things or the money or the property or whatever that the Lord has given us. Here you will see a map of essentially the city of David, that is the city of Jerusalem. And you will see the temple up toward the top there, and that's where the temple was being rebuilt, up on the Temple Mount, because one always went up to the temple. No matter where you were, from the north or the south or the east or the west, you always went up to the temple and up to Jerusalem because of the Temple Mount. There's the Kidron Valley, a valley of basically garbage that was there, where garbage was burned during the time when people lived in Jerusalem. In terms of a timeline, here we can see that at the beginning in 586, Cyrus decrees that the Jews can return to Jerusalem. He lets the captives free. And then Zerubbabel leads the exiles back into Judah. And in 536, the temple altar is rebuilt. So they're beginning to rebuild the temple. But then in 535 to about 520, the construction stops. Everyone gets tired, they're worried about their own security, and they're not sure what they should do until in 520, Haggai comes along with his prophetic message, and he says that temple rebuilding has to start again. It has to start again because that's what God has commanded us. And then in 515, the temple is completed. And so let's look at these messages that Haggai gives to his people. There are 5 messages, and each of them is significant. The first and the second message, and again, Haggai can be divided into 5 messages. Every message tries to persuade the people and their leaders to rebuild the temple. The first and second message in Haggai 1 through 15 claim that it is time to rebuild the temple so that Yahweh will be honored. Yahweh is dishonored by having his temple in this kind of a horrible, horrible situation, being beaten down and looking terrible. And so Haggai says you must rebuild it. Haggai then says to us in the third message, Haggai says, and this is starting in verse 15 of chapter 1, Yahweh says, I am with you, as I promised. The restored temple will be greater than the one that had been destroyed. Much of the complaints had to do with the fact that the temple was not going to be like what they expected. It was not going to be as nice as Solomon's temple. And so God promises them that it will be as nice as Solomon's temple. In the fourth message, Haggai in chapter 2, he makes the case that the people's uncleanness is a major factor in their difficult circumstances. The people's feeling of insecurity is a major factor of their difficult circumstances. But Yahweh will work among them always. Yahweh notes that the day his people returned to him and laid the foundation of the new temple marked a turning point toward blessing. Unfortunately, they stopped that blessing. They didn't do what they should have. And as a result, there were serious problems for the people. The fifth message, Haggai chapter 2 and verses 20 through 23. Yahweh says that he plans to overthrow the power of existing kingdoms, that one day Jerusalem and Israel will be a great kingdom. He uses an example of Zerubbabel. He says he will use Zerubbabel, that is the one that brought the people back. He will use him like a signet ring. A signet ring, as you can see here, was a sort of a ring that the king wore. And whenever there was something that he ordered or some message, they would drip wax onto whatever they were using, the scroll, and the king would put his ring into it so that they would know that this was not just some sort of a fraud, but that this message had actually come from the king. So with all this in mind, we can ask ourselves, why is it that we should study Haggai? What can Haggai do for us? How can Haggai transform my life and your life? Well, there are times when all of us, struggle to see God's presence. And we struggle to see where God is leading us. And it's difficult to continue in faith. This problem is only heightened by the social pressures of those who are around us. And so after years of economic struggle, as portrayed by Haggai and portrayed by Ezra in Ezra 3, the morale of God's people was extremely low. But the message, the timeless message of Haggai, is not specific to the completion of the temple or the leadership of Zerubbabel and Joshua. Instead, Haggai is about completing the work of Yahweh in general, about doing what Yahweh says. And Yahweh will be faithful to support them if they will be faithful to complete his work. It's easy to read Haggai and sort of come away with a materialistic message. It might be a message that goes something like, our lives will be less work, and God will give us more possessions and more things and more money if we build God's buildings and give our riches to help build those buildings. But that misunderstands what Haggai really has to say. We have to remember that this second temple, Solomon's being the first temple, this is the second temple. This second temple was as nothing compared to its predecessor. The people had just begun their work, and they needed inspiration to carry on. And they realized that the second temple paled in comparison to Solomon's temple. And those who remembered the first temple, they started to weep in Haggai 2:3 and in Ezra 3:12. The returned exiles weren't immediately given the prosperity that Haggai speaks about. Instead, it was a long journey. A long journey of faith was ahead of them. And the point of Haggai's prosperity statements is that Yahweh will provide for the work he starts. That Yahweh will indeed finish the projects that he commands his people to do. And we even today can understand that God will finish the projects that he causes his people to do. Here is a simple outline of Haggai. We've already talked about the 5 messages, and the first message is in chapter 1 through 11, or some go all the way through 15. Then there's a response to the first message. The second message starts in verse 15. The third message starts in chapter 2. The fourth message starts in chapter 2, verse 10, that uncleanness and blessing. And then the fifth message is this prophecy concerning Zerubbabel, that God will use him as a signet ring. The book seems to be materialistic. It seems to say that God won't bless your fields until you have rebuilt the temple. But what Haggai is doing is that he is maintaining an ancient link between faithfulness to Yahweh and fertility, and a drought coming, an economic crisis coming, resulting from the fact that the peoples had been selfish and they had been caring only for their own shelter and not for the building of God. It's easy to read Haggai and come away with that kind of message, but what should we do in the study of Haggai? Many of the writing prophets, and by writing prophets we mean those who have biblical books that include their prophecy, like Haggai and Zechariah and all through them. They are mentioned in the historical books. So it's not as if Haggai just shows up out of nowhere and is never mentioned again. They are mentioned in these historical books, Joshua and Chronicles. And so if you read the notes in a good study Bible alongside the biblical text, it will alert you to the fact that these prophets are mentioned in other places. And it will alert you to go back and read the sources about the person or about the prophet or about the figure whom you are reading about. If you happen to have the world's best Bible study software, Logos, or sometimes called Logos, you can do amazing things to search for a particular person like this. Logos has every single person tagged. So if you looked for Haggai in Logos, it would show you not only the times that the name Haggai shows up, but it would show you the times when you shows up and it refers to Haggai, the times when I show up and it refers to Haggai, the times when the prophet shows up and it refers to Haggai. It's an amazing tool. If you'd like to learn more about it, you can look at Logos, logos.com, and you'll see that there's a wealth of material. It's not inexpensive, but it's very, very good. John Calvin says, every blessing that God confers upon us perishes through our carelessness if we are not prompt and active in rendering thanks. I think that Calvin is overstating the case for effect there, because it would be impossible for us to thank God for everything that he does for us. Otherwise, we would be doing nothing but thanking God. And maybe that's what Paul means when he says pray without ceasing, that we go through our lives with an attitude of thankfulness, knowing that we would have nothing were it not for him. That I would not have a computer, I would not have a studio in which to tape this message, if it were not for the faithfulness of God himself. And so let's think for just a few moments about Haggai's message today. The message of Haggai is it's not just about the completion of the temple or the leadership of Zerubbabel and Joshua. Instead, Haggai is about completing the work of Yahweh in general. Yahweh will be faithful to complete the work if Yahweh's people dedicate themselves to the work. The key is to ask Yahweh permission to continue doing his work and then complete the effort in the original spirit. God had asked his people, commanded his people to finish the temple, and they just didn't do it. And so Hugh of St. Victor says, willingly we should surrender earthly in order to acquire heavenly goods. The kingdom of heaven is well worth all that you are possessed of. And that's something for all of us to remember. The kingdom of heaven is worth everything that we possess. And so if we spend time or money or effort or talent on helping the kingdom, it's worth much less than the kingdom itself. At the beginning, when the people whom Haggai was prophesying to wouldn't do the work, Haggai said this about them. He said, you have sown much and harvested little. You eat, but you never have enough. You drink, but you never have your fill. You clothe yourselves, but no one is warm. And he who earns wages does so to put them into a bag filled with holes. Sometimes we feel like the wages that we earn are put into a bag filled with holes and we don't know where the money goes. Haggai knew that feeling, and the people of Israel knew that feeling. And God is saying to them, as long as you ignore what I have asked you to do, you will continually be putting your wages into a bag filled with holes. And when they ceased to work with Yahweh, that's the way that they felt. However, within 5 years of having the temple built, having the temple finished, Haggai delivered his message. When the temple rebuilding was complete, there's a beautiful picture of faithfulness of God and what a long struggle can actually accomplish in our own lives. So let's ask a couple of questions from Haggai. Haggai's questions for you. In Haggai, what God requires is hard work, dedication, collaboration, and faith that he will honor the effort that we are engaged in. What goal has God called you to? What goal has God called you to work toward so that he might take pleasure and be glorified through your actions? Take a minute and write down what those goals are so that you might honor God through your actions. Here's another question. When the people who remember the first temple complain about the new temple, they say this temple that we have is nothing compared to the old temple. Yahweh has to command them to be strong and remind them of his past and his continual presence. How much stock do you put in physical appearances? How much stock do you put in the big, gigantic place? Does discouragement at what you see around you, at what you see God doing, draw your attention away from God's character and presence? God is not always in the big, the shiny, the new building, but sometimes God is in the small, the still, the quiet voice that he comes and speaks to us with. And finally, the returned exiles, they faced a great deal of difficulty because they had abandoned the work of Yahweh. God had used the difficulty to get their attention, and perhaps God is using difficulty to get your attention. What spiritual work is God calling you to do today? What difficult thing is God calling you to do today? There's something, I believe, that every one of you who are listening to this message has been called by God to do something. And I hope that the book of Haggai will push you to doing that particular action. Well, I hope that you have a wonderful Thanksgiving if you see this before Thanksgiving. I hope that if you see it afterwards, you still have a great time of Thanksgiving. In the next few weeks, we'll be looking at the Inter-Testamental Period, sometimes called the Second Temple Period, because it is the period between the building of this temple through Haggai and what happens until the book of Matthew. You may be completely unfamiliar with what happens during those years, but I can assure you that they make a huge difference in our understanding of the New Testament. So I hope that you'll join me next week in looking at the Second Temple Period, because it has a lot of great things to say to us. Until then, live in thankfulness, do what God has called you to, finish the job, and be blessed by reading the book of Haggai. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you again next week at Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church Sunday School. Thank you.